Hello, History 1 students. This is Mrs. Politsky, and I have notes for Chapter 11, Section 2, Farming the Plains. And to start with, I want to talk about this area kind of known as the Great Plains. The Great Plains, for the most part, extends westward to the Rocky Mountains from around the 100th meridian. That would be roughly Cozad, Nebraska, to basically the metropolitan area of Denver. It's an imaginary line that runs north and south from the central Dakotas, basically through western Texas. And the deal about the Great Plains for the most part is the fact that it kind of gets a bad reputation. Back in 1819, there had been an expeditionary group that went through this part of the country, headed by a guy named Stephen Long. And Stephen Long wrote about this trip, and he named this region the Great American Desert. Part of it being the fact that there was scarcely any trees, there wasn't a lot of water, and for the most part, he believed that it would be very difficult to settle this part of the land. And to a certain degree, he was right. But during this 100 years or so of great settlement, basically from about the 1820s through the beginning of the 20th century, one of the things that kind of was done to kind of help get people to move to this part of the country was some promotion that happened at different states. And in Nebraska, there was an old saying that rain followed the plow. And from the 1870s through the 1880s, there might have been a little bit of truth to that. We had had a decade there of above average rainfall, but by the time the 1890s roll around, we're in the midst of a serious drought that's going to happen, and it's going to force a lot of folks that had settled here to pack up and leave. For centuries, this open country had been home to vast herds of buffalo that grazed on the prairie grasses. And if you have buffalo, you're also going to have a thriving population of Native Americans. As settlers head west and they want to start farming, those roaming herds of buffalo become a big problem. Along with that, with the development of the Transcontinental Railroad, again, we're going to have some issues here as far as what we're going to do with the buffalo as well. And so it was not uncommon to hear about railroad companies such as the Union Pacific hosting excursions to go out and hunt buffalo. What you see here are a number of hides that had been harvested from one of these hunting expeditions. And the hides themselves could be sold back east for a very good sum of money. Along with that, the leather that came from the hides themselves actually was a very vital item when we talk about um, being able to make belts for the industrial factories in the east. Uh, the hides, the belts, the leather, if you want to get to it, was high quality that came from this buffalo hide. And hence, it really, in a way, kind of was fueling the industrial growth, the industrial revolution that was happening after the Civil War. The government supported the settlement of the Great Plains region by passing what was known as the Homestead Act in 1862. Sometimes we should kind of lump this into one of those things that kind of is involved in Reconstruction. The big thing here with the Homestead Act is that a homesteader could claim up to roughly 160 acres. They had to put down some money for the most part to make this happen. Usually it was a $10 registration fee. And as long as they stayed on that land for roughly 5 years and made improvements, and some of the improvements would be cultivating the land by planting crops or planting trees, and also building an outbuilding of some type. So it could be like a sod house that you see here, like one of these little soddies. It could be a shack. There were certain dimensions that were spelled out, like how much or how many feet by this many feet that the dwelling had to have. But you had 5 years to do that. And if you met all those qualifications at the end of 5 years, you would be given the deed to the property. Okay, the first man to actually stake a claim under the Homestead Act was a guy named Daniel Freeman. This is a picture of Freeman, a photograph of Freeman when he was a much older man. But Daniel Freeman staked out his claim not very far from the present day city of Beatrice, Nebraska. As a matter of fact, if you go down to Beatrice, the National Park Service actually has a facility there that is known as Homestead National Monument um, on the land that Daniel Freeman and his family, for the most part, homesteaded. Freeman made this, staked this claim, filed the claim on, I believe, January 1st or 2nd, 1863, once it went into effect, and then promptly packed up and headed off with the Nebraska Volunteers to fight in the American Civil War. When he came home, that's what he did. He started working hard to improve up this land, and eventually he was able to keep his claim. Needless to say, most settlers of the plains built their first homes out of sod. Part of that being the fact that there wasn't a lot of um, timber to be utilized, and if you wanted to build a house out of wood, you probably would have had to order the timber to be shipped to you, and that took a little bit of time. Many of our homesteaders, they faced a lot of challenges in the time that they were trying to prove up everything from fires on the plains to insects, drought, let alone the blizzards that can happen out here on the plains. Certainly um, were major challenges for many of these people. So I want to talk a little bit about the in and outs of the Homestead Act, and then we're going to talk a little bit about the Transcontinental Railroad. You are going to need a sheet of paper to jot down these things. So if you have room on your handout, that's great. Otherwise, find a piece of scratch paper to write it down. But the Homestead Act, the initial one from 1862, put about 80 million acres of land up for grabs. About two-thirds of all these homesteaders that tried to prove up their land failed, which is a really an outstanding rate of failure. But understanding what was at stake and how difficult it was, maybe it does make sense. 20 million homesteaders came west. To claim about 3 million acres. So we don't necessarily claim all the land that was available. It went into effect on January 1st, 1863, same day as the Emancipation Proclamation. Along with that, to bring people westward, we're going to need some transportation. And the birth of the Transcontinental Railroad certainly was part of that. Union Pacific, out of basically at that time would have been Council Bluffs, Iowa, probably more famously known for Omaha, Nebraska, and the Central Pacific, which was coming out of Sacramento, California. The goal here was these two railroad lines were going to meet up and, for the most part, make that first transcontinental railroad line available. To get these companies some kind of incentive to do this work, the government gave them land. Roughly 131 million acres of lands were given to both of these companies. It's kind of equal to about the size of Texas, or about 1/10 of the continental United States. What Union Pacific did, and eventually probably the Central Pacific, is that they gridded the land off like a checkerboard. And so certain sections of land were available for homesteading. Other sections were basically owned by the railroad company. Many of the railroad companies, what they did is they waited until they could properly market this land for sale, and eventually they made it for sale, um, with the hopes of maybe forming communities and things of that nature. Within Nebraska, when we talk about where is this land located, roughly 20 miles north and south of the Union Pacific line. So if you're in Platte County, that would basically go from roughly Columbus, Nebraska, all the way up to about Humphrey, or the Platte Madison County line. Every other section was owned by Union Pacific. And so that meant that Union Pacific, if they marketed it correctly, they could actually build communities. And that's exactly what they did. Going onward, the railroads, as a result of being built, really made it possible for those people who were living in this part of the country to have access to, civilization, if you want to call it that. It allowed farmers to put goods for sale for markets back east. So it made the moving of commercial agricultural products definitely possible. Another thing that kind of helped establish the West was something that was also passed during the Lincoln presidency called the Morrill Act. It established what we call land grant schools or land grant universities. The state, for the most part, that were participating, they would receive land from the federal government to establish a state university. Some of this land could be sold or rented. Roughly 30,000 acres were given for every member of Congress. And in the process, about 69 schools, universities were established. Today, only 47 still exist. The University in Nebraska was one of the first. But also Cornell and Rutgers universities back east were also part of this. States loyal to the Union could receive their grants first, and then the rest of the United States. So if you ever happen to be on the campus of the University of Nebraska and you ever go by Morrill Hall, sometimes it's known as Elephant Hall, the building that you see photographed here is roughly the same building that you see today, with the exception that you're going to see maybe a statue of an elephant or for the most part, a woolly mammoth out in front of it. The wheat belt. For the most part, dry farming was a method that was primarily utilized by a lot of our settlers. What this basically entailed is that you had to plant your seeds deep into the ground where it was believed that there would be enough moisture to help the wheat germinate and the seed out. Many sodbusters eventually lost their homestead because of drought and wind and erosion or the overuse of land. Really, from about the 1860s onward, we're going to see that there's going to be a lot of folks that are going to be raising wheat, and eventually, what we're going to see is that the prices start coming down. As a result of that, some people go bust, they go bankrupt, and if they leave the land, they don't necessarily prepare the land to go back to its original form. And what we see are some problems with dust and erosion, very similar to what we're going to see in the 1930s during the time of the Dust Bowl. Large landholders invested in things like mechanical reapers and steam tractors, which made it easier to harvest larger crops. Part of this was part of the whole boom of this era of time. Wheat belt, this would encompass places like the Dakotas, parts of Nebraska, and really a good chunk of Kansas. Bonanza farms were farms that covered roughly 50,000 acres and yielded big profits. These bonanza farms, for the most part, relied on a lot of labor to get the crops in and out. And finally, in letter F here, in the 1890s, we had a glut of wheat that was on the world market that caused the prices to drop. Some farmers tried to make it through the lean periods by mortgaging their land. And unfortunately, when you start mortgaging your land, when you have poor farm prices, it makes it very hard to stay in the game. In the 1890s, the Census Bureau reported that there was no longer a true frontier left in America. This kind of goes back to a kind of famous historian, Frederick Jackson Turner, who basically said that the frontier had closed. And as a result of that, this whole safety valve of social discontent also closed as well. If you were a person who was struggling back east, there was always hope and opportunity to go west. And once we get to about the 1890s, there isn't really any other place to go. Some people believe that the existence of unoccupied land at the frontier had provided, again, a safety valve of social discontent. The idea that Americans could always make a fresh start. Thank you very much.